Shelley Connolly was a petite, spunky, typical 16-year-old living in Anchorage, Alaska. She was a little rebellious at times, liked to roller skate, have sleepovers, and occasionally break the rules to party. On January 6, 1978, her stepsister Carrie and Carrie's boyfriend saw Shelley in the parking lot of a bar called Chilkoot Charlie's talking to three young men. Shelley was a regular at the bar that was known for letting teens drink alcohol at the time. The bouncer at the bar told police he saw her leaving the bar with three men between 2 and 2:30 a.m. in a small, dark-colored sedan. The next day, her body was found by tourists alongside the Seward Highway near milepost 109. She had been raped and left to die near the railroad. Her death was caused by a combination of a blow to her abdomen and hypothermia. Evidence showed that before she died, she tried to climb the embankment for help. The case was closed and reopened several times between 1978 and 1997 as police identified several suspects, but found no conclusive evidence to link them to the murder. In 1997, a DNA profile was developed from an unknown male from biological evidence that had been collected at the autopsy. In 2003, DNA evidence from the crime scene was uploaded to CODIS, but no match was found. Then in 2019, the DNA found under her fingernails was sent to Parabon Nanolabs and pointed to a set of 3 McQuaid brothers using genetic genealogy. In June of that year, investigators collected 2 cigarette butts that Donald McQuaid had dropped and processed them for DNA evidence. His DNA was an exact match to the DNA found under Shelley's fingernails. He was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Shelley and extradited to Alaska. McQuaid was 21 and lived in Alaska in 1978 when she was murdered. He matched the description that witnesses gave of one of the men Shelley was seen leaving the bar with before she was murdered. He also drove a car that matched the description that witnesses gave, but he was never on the radar as a suspect. McQuaid admits to having problems with alcohol in 1978 and memory deficits because of it. He stated that he did not kill Shelley, but it is possible the two had intercourse, but he doesn't remember. Even with the DNA, he and his family are still adamant that he is innocent. Over the years, McQuaid had lived in and out of Alaska. Court records show a number of minor charges over the years, as well as domestic violence and stalking charges. McQuaid now suffers from stage 4 liver cancer and has requested reduced bail and released with ankle monitoring so he can receive treatment for the cancer and live with his family on the West Coast. The judge approved his $1 million bail to be reduced to $10,000 due to COVID-19 risk, which he did contract while in custody. The judge also approved 24/7 ankle monitoring, house arrest at his mother-in-law's home in Washington, and a prepaid return airline ticket back to Alaska. Sadly, Shelley's mother Judy passed away in August 2021, but was at least able to see the arrest of her daughter's alleged killer prior to her death. Emily Jeanette Garcia was born in 1977 in Fort Hood, Texas, to Sheila and Roy. Her parents met in Germany while serving in the U.S. Army and would later marry. However, they would divorce several years later and share custody of their daughters Emily and Elizabeth. In January of 1993, Emily was 15 years old and Elizabeth was 16 or 17, and both girls were pregnant. Then on February 12, 1993, Emily had boarded the city bus in San Antonio, Texas, to go to an appointment regarding her pregnancy and then planned to visit a friend. However, she never made it to that appointment. Emily was living away from her mother and sister at the time and staying with friends in the northeastern part of San Antonio. She was known to hang out with friends in that area of the city and frequent pool halls. On February 25, 1993, a road crew that was clearing brush from a storm the night before found the nude body of a young female on Old Cranes Mill Road off of Highway 46 in Canyon Lake, Texas. There were no personal belongings or clothing found, and the medical examiners concluded that the Jane Doe was a victim of murder, was 3 months pregnant with a boy, and had been deceased for less than 24 hours. One report states that Emily became pregnant while at juvenile detention for running away, but there is no proof of that. Sadly, she was buried in a potter's grave in New Braunfels, Texas. Over a year later, the Jane Doe would be linked to Emily when her mother Sheila saw a news segment about the Jane Doe on the 1-year anniversary of finding her body and immediately went to the police to see if it was her daughter. Sheila had taken her girls to be fingerprinted when they were very young, and she took Emily's fingerprint card to the police with her. Once they compared the card to the prints of the Jane Doe, they knew for sure that it was indeed Emily. Emily's body was then exhumed, and she was given a proper burial as Emily Jeanette Garcia in Somerset, Texas, in the Garcia plots. At some point, it was determined that Emily had been kidnapped and held against her will for 12 days. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. Strangely, it was determined that she was tied up after she was killed. In early 2021, at the request of the Sheriff's Office, the Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program began reviewing the case. They re-interviewed friends of Emily and a person of interest named Thomas Galindo. At the time of the murder, he was a 21-year-old acquaintance of Emily. In August of 2021, Texas Rangers released a 2.5-minute YouTube video regarding her unsolved murder. Then, the next month, on September 10, 2021, U.S. Marshals arrested 50-year-old Thomas Ray Galindo at his home in Brazoria, Texas, and charged him with killing Emily. Police said new information gathered during the interviews led to his arrest. It is unclear what evidence actually led to his arrest, but as of October 2021, he is awaiting trial. On December 27, 1977, a group of hunters discovered skeletal human remains in the community of Escatawpa in Pascagoula, Mississippi. The remains were located at a construction site near the area that is now Highway 613 and Interstate 10, which was under construction at the time. A medical exam revealed the remains belonged to an African American woman that was small in stature with a front gold tooth and possibly wore a wig. The remains were discovered 3 or 4 months after she was killed. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Escatawpa Jane Doe. Over the years, several facial reconstructions and computer composites were created in an effort to help identify her. Nearly 35 years later, in 2012, Pascagoula police investigator Darren Versiga uploaded the victim's information into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. But the attempts to identify the remains were unsuccessful at the time. Samuel Little was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 3 Los Angeles women during the 1980s. In 2018, he confessed to 93 murders, many of them across the Southeast. Little was confirmed in 2018 as the most prolific serial killer in the U.S. after confessing to those murders that took place between 1970 and 2005 in at least 14 states. The FBI also believes all of those confessions to be credible. In January 2021, Author Incorporated was contracted to attempt to create a family tree based on the victim's DNA. That same month, they were able to give investigator Matt Hoggett information of a possible distant cousin of the victim living in Texas. Investigator Hoggett found the cousin, who then referred him to her 93-year-old grandmother, who was also living in Texas. The grandmother told him that her cousin, Clara Birdlong, had gone missing from Leflore County, Mississippi, sometime in the 1970s. Another distant cousin in Texas said Clara went by the nickname Nuttin and described her as a small woman who had a gold front tooth and wore a wig. The cousin also recalled Clara disappeared in the 1970s. Then in August 2021, investigator Hoggett found a former friend of Clara's in Leflore County. She said Clara left town in the 70s with an African American man who claimed to be passing through Mississippi on his way to Florida, and that Clara was never seen or heard from again. In September 2021, Hoggett requested DNA samples from several people closely associated with Clara to compare DNA. Othram analyzed the samples and confirmed the DNA matched the grandmother. After further investigation and elimination of all other living and deceased relatives, investigators concluded the victim, known as Escatawpa Jane Doe, was Clara Birdlong, born in 1933 in LaFleur County, Mississippi, a 44-year-old mystery finally solved. Investigators eventually learned Samuel Little was arrested in Pascagoula in August of 1977 for petty theft. He said he would pick up vulnerable women from bars, nightclubs, or along the streets and then strangle them to death in the back seat of his car. He said he often targeted young black women that were estranged from their families with poverty and addiction. In many cases, their disappearances and deaths did not draw the same level of attention as other killings at the time. Many of the deaths were originally ruled overdoses, and others were attributed to accidental or undetermined causes, and authorities added that some of the bodies were never even found. He admitted to killing a woman in 1977, whom investigators believe was Clara. He said that her wig fell off in his car, which is why it wasn't found at the crime scene. He even drew a picture of her from memory, but didn't know her name. Investigators confirmed Little was in Jackson County in 1977, around the time of the murder. The cause of Clara's death still remains undetermined, and Little died of natural causes at the end of 2020 while in prison. As of today, he is still considered a prime suspect in her death. Bonnie Craig was an 18-year-old college freshman at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. She was described as a very sweet girl that was mature, reliable, and warm-hearted. She didn't drive, so 2 days a week she would walk 45 minutes through the early morning darkness to catch the bus. On September 28, 1994, at about 5 a.m., she began her journey to make her 7 a.m. English class. However, she never arrived, and at 2:15 p.m., a woman hiking near McHugh Creek found her floating in the water. The medical examiner determined that she had suffered severe head injuries. At first, Alaska state troopers believed Bonnie had died in a hiking accident. However, her mother Karen strongly disagreed. When she viewed her daughter's body, she saw defensive wounds on her hands. She also knew that Bonnie would not skip school and go to the creek area. Also, the creek was 10 miles from the bus stop, and she would have had no way of getting there. Plus, her belongings she left with that morning were not found with her body. Police initially reported to Karen that Bonnie had not been sexually assaulted. But 6 months later, she learned that that was not true, and semen had actually been found during the exam. At this point, the DNA from her body was entered into CODIS, but sadly, there was no match. Frustrated with the investigators, Karen began her own investigation. According to Karen, the police kept most of the information about this case to themselves. Karen was angry about this because she had experience in law enforcement. She had worked undercover with the police department before and wanted to help. Also, she suspected that Bonnie's murder might have had something to do with that undercover work she had done. An informant told her that her family may have been targeted by a drug lord after a sting she was involved in resulted in the arrest of several members of his organization. He also claimed that Bonnie's murder was a message to the police department to back off. According to Karen, Bonnie was murdered the day after the people that she identified were released from jail. She often gave the investigators leads to go on, but she didn't believe they followed up on them. However, they claim they did look into the leads that she gave them, they just had not shared all of their information about the case with her. 1 year later, one of Bonnie's professors contacted Karen. She became suspicious of one of her students, suspecting that he may have been involved in Bonnie's murder. According to the professor, the student made several references to the day of the murder in his journal, claiming it would be a very tough day and that he would be put to a test. According to Karen, some of his writings were also violent. The professor also claimed that the student was late for school the day she was murdered. When he came to class, she noticed that he was wet, like he had just got out of a shower. She also said it smelled like he had poured a whole bottle of cologne on himself. On top of all this, he was strangely noted to have been an onlooker at the crime scene the day of the murder. However, DNA evidence ruled him out as a suspect. Finally, 12 years later, in November 2006, DNA finally got a hit in CODIS. It was matched to 36-year-old Kenneth Dion, who was imprisoned in New Hampshire for several armed robberies when the match was made. At the time of her murder, he lived in the area, was on probation for robbery, and had been released from an Alaska prison just a few months earlier. He had also served time on assault charges. In the past, he had allegedly told a former girlfriend and his sister that he could never go back to Alaska because he had killed someone there. He had been kicked out of the Army for drug use and was addicted to cocaine at the time of the murder. In 2007, Dion was charged with Bonnie's rape and murder. It is believed that the crime was a random act of violence and that he picked her up while she was walking to the bus stop. At trial in May 2011, he claimed that he had consensual sex with her and that she accidentally fell to her death while alone at the creek. However, this contradicted with his original statement where he claimed to not know her. Also, her family says she was in a devoted relationship with her boyfriend Cameron, who was at college in California at the time. Dion could also not account for his whereabouts on the day that she vanished, and his wife said that he was not home the entire week. It was during the trial that Karen found out that troopers made several mistakes, but did in fact conduct a thorough investigation. Furthermore, the medical examiner determined that Bonnie's injuries were caused by a blunt object or weapon, not from a fall. At the time, Dion carried martial arts weapons in his car, which could have inflicted the injuries. Also, a leaf with her blood on it was found above the cliff area, proving that she was already injured before going off the cliff. On June 15, 2011, Dion was found guilty of her rape and murder. Her mother, Karen, has since written a book about the case called Justice for Bonnie.